David had always believed his 1,500 acres of land were untouchable, a family legacy passed down for generations. But one ordinary afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a letter from the HOA, casually claiming that his land had been reallocated and partially sold to fund their projects. At first, David laughed, thinking it had to be a clerical mistake. But when he drove to the courthouse to check the records, his stomach sank. The HOA had filed fraudulent paperwork, transferring ownership rights to themselves. The land wasn't just dirt and trees, it held streams, fertile soil, and precious family memories. His grandfather's old barn, the fishing creek where he learned to cast a line, and the trails he hiked as a boy, all stolen on paper with a few forged signatures. Neighbors whispered that the HOA wanted to build luxury homes near the lake, selling prime spots to developers. It wasn't just greed, it was a plan to erase everything David's family had worked for. David clenched the letter in his hand, anger rising. But he wasn't going to fight with shouting or fists. He was going to fight with strategy. And deep down, he knew he had something the HOA didn't: patience, knowledge of his land, and a legal trump card they would never see coming. Days turned into weeks as David investigated. He learned the HOA had struck deals with real estate investors, promising them lakefront access once David's land was officially part of the subdivision. The paperwork was riddled with lies, but shockingly, it looked legitimate on the surface. They had sold off parcels they didn't own, pocketing millions in early fees. David sat at his dining table late at night, surrounded by maps, deeds, and dusty family records. His grandfather had been meticulous, filing every boundary survey and water right decades earlier. The more David read, the more powerful he felt. These weren't just old papers, they were ironclad proof that the HOA's so-called land transfer was illegal. But David didn't stop there. He noticed something else: the HOA had accidentally tied their own high-value properties into his family's land through sloppy filings. Their prized $10 million lakefront mansions, the crown jewel of the community, legally depended on easements that ran through his acres. That mistake would become David's golden weapon. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading. "You wanted to sell my land?" he whispered. "Fine. I'll sell yours." David didn't rush. He knew timing was everything. Outwardly, he acted as if he were defeated, even nodding politely when HOA board members smirked at him in town. Behind closed doors, however, he was drafting legal motions and meeting with quiet but powerful allies, lawyers who specialized in property disputes. He walked the borders of his acres, marking every fence post, every water channel, and every trail. His neighbors saw him working and assumed he was just nursing old wounds. But in truth, David was preparing for a move that would shake the entire community. The HOA grew bolder, hosting barbecues and boasting about the new lakefront projects. Karen, the HOA president, often paraded around the lake, telling new buyers that the old landowner had finally let go. David would nod, smile faintly, and say nothing. At night, though, he stood on the edge of the lake, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. This wasn't just land to him, it was home. And if the HOA thought they could erase him from it, they had underestimated the quiet fire inside him. The storm was coming, and David was ready to strike. The day came when David walked into the county records office, papers neatly stacked in his hand. Within hours, filings were updated, corrections submitted, and notices served. The very same loopholes the HOA had used against him, David now turned back on them with precision. He didn't reclaim his land through anger. He reclaimed it through law. And when the dust settled, the courthouse recognized that the HOA had overstepped their authority. Not only was David's 1,500 acres secure, but now their multi-million-dollar lakefront properties were entangled in his easements. A week later, for sale signs appeared, except they weren't on David's fields. They were in front of the HOA's glittering mansions. Confusion swept the neighborhood. Homeowners gasped as they realized their cherished lakefront views now rested in David's hands. Karen stormed into David's driveway, demanding answers. But David stood tall, calm, and firm. "You wanted my land," he said evenly. "Now I own your lake." Her face turned pale. The fight she thought she had won was over, and she had lost far more than she ever imagined. News spread like wildfire. Local newspapers ran headlines: HOA land grab backfires, homeowner sells their own properties. Investors pulled out of deals, furious at being misled. Families who had trusted the HOA felt betrayed, realizing their homes were tied to false promises. Karen tried to rally support, calling emergency HOA meetings. But every time she pointed at David as the villain, he calmly presented documents showing the truth. The crowd murmured, anger shifting not at him, but at her. Within weeks, the HOA's reputation crumbled. Longtime board members resigned, unwilling to stand in the fire. Their dream of expanding into luxury development collapsed. And worst of all for them, David legally began selling off the lakefront properties, piece by piece, to outside buyers who respected the land far more than the HOA ever did. For every sale, David reinvested in restoring his acres, planting trees, repairing trails, and reviving the old barn. The land flourished, while the HOA fell into chaos. As months passed, the lakefront community changed forever. Where once the HOA boasted about exclusivity and control, now it stood fractured, humbled, and powerless. David walked his land each morning, the crisp air filling his lungs, knowing his family's legacy was safe again. He rebuilt the fishing dock where he had learned to cast as a boy, inviting local kids to come and fish free of charge. The land, once threatened by greed, now pulsed with life and laughter. His neighbors, who had once stayed silent, now thanked him for standing up, not just for himself, but for fairness. Karen, once the face of power, now lived quietly, her influence shattered. People avoided her, whispers following wherever she went. And every time she passed the lake, she was reminded of the empire she tried to build and how it had slipped away into the hands of the very man she tried to destroy. David didn't celebrate with noise. He simply smiled, knowing he had turned pain into victory and protected what truly mattered. One crisp autumn evening, David sat on his porch, watching the sunset spill gold across the lake. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer. "Congratulations," the man said. "The last property sale is finalized. You've officially closed the book on the HOA's empire." David chuckled softly, sipping his coffee. "Funny," he said. "They thought they sold me out. Turns out, I sold them out instead." And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.